The shrill ring of her phone sliced through the tense silence of the boardroom. Across the polished mahogany table, 7 sets of eyes bore into her, each pair more hostile than the last. The air conditioning hummed in the background, doing little to cool the sweat trickling down her spine. She glanced at the caller ID. It was the 8th time that morning her personal lawyer had tried to reach her. "Ms. Carter," the CEO's voice cut through her thoughts, sharp as a blade, "perhaps you'd care to explain these irregularities we've discovered in your department's financial reports?" Alexandra Carter straightened in her chair, her fingers gripping the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles turned white. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows behind the executives, Manhattan stretched out beneath them, oblivious to the storm brewing inside this 47th-floor conference room. Her mind raced back to the countless nights she'd spent poring over those same financial reports, the inconsistencies jumping out at her like neon signs in the darkness. "I'm afraid I can't take credit for discovering those irregularities," she responded, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "I merely reported what I found. What any responsible chief compliance officer would do when confronted with evidence of a $90 million fraud scheme." The CFO shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his expensive suit suddenly looking 2 sizes too small. Alexandra watched as beads of sweat formed on his forehead, mirroring her own anxiety but for entirely different reasons. She knew exactly how deep this rabbit hole went, 3 years of meticulous documentation stored in encrypted files on an external drive safely hidden in her apartment. "Ms. Carter," the general counsel interjected, his tone carefully measured, "we must consider the possibility that your zealousness in pursuing these allegations might be motivated by personal grievances against certain members of our executive team." Her laugh caught them off guard, a bitter hollow sound that ricocheted off the glass walls. "Personal grievances? Really? That's your defense after I've uncovered one of the largest corporate fraud schemes in recent history?" She leaned forward, her dark eyes locking onto each executive in turn. "Let me make something perfectly clear. I didn't fabricate these documents. I didn't manipulate the numbers. All I did was shine a light on what was already there." The memory of her discovery flashed before her eyes, late nights in the office, chasing discrepancies that shouldn't have existed, following digital breadcrumbs through encrypted files and shell companies until she'd pieced together the elaborate web of deceit. Each revelation had been like peeling layers from an onion, exposing corruption that reached far beyond what she'd initially suspected. "You're making this very difficult for yourself," the CEO warned, his voice dropping an octave. "We can resolve this matter quietly, without involving outside parties. A generous severance package, perhaps a non-disclosure agreement." "A bribe, you mean?" Alexandra interrupted, her voice cold as steel. "You want me to keep quiet about embezzlement, money laundering, and securities fraud that affects thousands of shareholders and employees? Is that really how you think this is going to play out?" The room fell silent except for the rhythmic ticking of the antique clock on the wall. 17 minutes past 10. She committed the time to memory, just as she had every other detail of this confrontation. Outside, clouds gathered over the city skyline, casting long shadows across the conference room. The storm she'd sensed building for months was finally breaking, and Alexandra Carter was ready to face it head-on. Every evening for the past 6 months, Alexandra had retreated to her modest Queen's apartment, transforming her living room into a fortress of evidence. The coffee table groaned under the weight of financial statements, internal memos, and encrypted flash drives, while her laptop displayed a complex web of connections between offshore accounts and shell corporations. The worn-out couch cushions bore the imprint of countless sleepless nights, her body curled protectively around documents that could bring down one of Wall Street's most powerful institutions. She remembered the first crack in the facade, a seemingly innocuous discrepancy in quarterly reports that refused to reconcile. As Chief Compliance Officer, she'd initially dismissed it as human error, until similar anomalies began appearing in subsidiaries across Europe and Asia. The pattern was unmistakable: phantom transactions, inflated revenue figures, and disappearing funds, all pointing to a sophisticated scheme orchestrated by the company's top brass. Each piece of evidence she uncovered added another layer to the intricate puzzle. There were the late-night emails forwarded to her personal account, documenting suspicious fund transfers approved by ghost signatures. The encrypted chat logs between executives discussing creative accounting solutions. Most damning of all were the whistleblower reports from terrified junior analysts, their voices trembling as they described being pressured to falsify records. Alexandra had recorded every conversation, stored every document, built an ironclad case that no legal team could dismantle. Her methods became increasingly clandestine as the stakes grew higher. She memorized security patrol schedules, learned which elevators bypassed security cameras, and developed a sixth sense for detecting when someone was watching her workstation. The stress manifested physically: persistent migraines, ulcers from skipping meals, and hands that trembled even when she wasn't holding incriminating documents. Yet with each new discovery, her resolve hardened. The isolation was perhaps the hardest part. Colleagues who once shared lunch breaks now avoided eye contact in the hallway. HR representatives who used to greet her warmly now offered tight-lipped smiles. Even her assistant, Maria, had stopped bringing her morning coffee, citing other priorities. But Alexandra understood. Anyone seen associating too closely with her risked becoming collateral damage in the unfolding drama. Her apartment became both sanctuary and prison. Takeout containers piled up in the kitchen, testament to meals eaten alone while analyzing transaction patterns. The blinds remained perpetually drawn, not just for privacy but to shield herself from the accusing stares of neighbors who worked for the same company. At night, she lay awake listening to the distant hum of traffic, rehearsing testimonies in her mind and calculating exit strategies should her cover be blown. Despite the mounting pressure, Alexandra maintained an outward appearance of normalcy at work. She attended meetings with practiced calm, took diligent notes during compliance reviews, and smiled politely at water cooler conversations. Only those who knew her best could detect the subtle changes: the way her eyes lingered just a second longer on certain executives, the almost imperceptible tightening of her jaw when discussing specific projects, the methodical precision with which she documented everything. The emotional toll manifested in unexpected ways. She caught herself jumping at sudden noises, her heart racing when her phone buzzed with unknown numbers. Memories of happier times, company picnics, holiday parties, team celebrations, now felt tainted, viewed through the lens of betrayal. The framed photographs of smiling colleagues on her desk stared back at her like strangers wearing familiar faces. Yet through it all, Alexandra clung to one unshakable truth: she was the only thing standing between the company's corrupt leadership and justice. Every sleepless night, every skipped meal, every anxious moment was worth it if it meant protecting the thousands of honest employees and investors who trusted this institution. The evidence surrounding her wasn't just paper and pixels. It represented hope for accountability, integrity, and change in a system that had grown dangerously complacent in its power. As she sat cross-legged on her living room floor, surrounded by years of painstakingly gathered proof, Alexandra allowed herself a rare moment of vulnerability. Her hands shook as she traced the edges of particularly damning documents, tears blurring the ink of signatures that had once commanded her respect. Then she wiped her eyes, secured the latest batch of evidence in its fireproof safe, and prepared for another day of maintaining her double life: dutiful employee by day, determined whistleblower by night. The termination meeting unfolded with clinical precision, each word calculated to wound while maintaining plausible deniability. Human Resources Director Patricia Langley led the procession into Alexandra's office, flanked by two security guards whose presence transformed the familiar space into something alien and threatening. The golden afternoon light streaming through her floor-to-ceiling windows cast long shadows across her meticulously organized desk, a stark contrast to the chaos about to unfold. "Ms. Carter, please gather your personal belongings," Langley instructed, her usually warm demeanor replaced by professional detachment. "Security will escort you from the premises immediately." Alexandra's fingers hovered over her keyboard, momentarily paralyzed. This was it, the moment she'd anticipated but never truly believed would come. The termination letter slid across her desk, its official seal mocking her years of dedicated service. Her eyes scanned the carefully crafted language: termination for cause, breach of company protocol, misuse of company resources. Each phrase a dagger wrapped in bureaucratic velvet. Methodically, she began packing her personal items, acutely aware of the security guard's watchful eyes. The framed photograph of her parents disappeared into her tote bag, followed by a silver pen set gifted by her team on her 5th anniversary. Her hands trembled as she reached for the small potted succulent sitting on her windowsill, the only living thing she'd allowed herself in this sterile environment. The plant's resilience through neglect seemed cruelly ironic now. "Your access credentials will be deactivated immediately," Langley continued, checking items off an invisible list. "Please surrender your company-issued devices and building pass." The click of her heels against the marble floor punctuated each requirement like a countdown to exile. Alexandra placed her laptop and phone on the desk, watching as a security guard collected them with gloved hands. Years of work, contacts, and memories reduced to confiscated property. She forced herself to focus on practical details, remembering her parking garage level, noting the time to ensure she wouldn't miss her lawyer's call, mentally cataloging which documents she needed to retrieve from her apartment. "You'll receive your final paycheck and COBRA information via mail," Langley droned on, her voice devoid of emotion. "And remember, your non-disclosure agreement remains in effect." The words trailed off as Alexandra stood, her tote bag slung over her shoulder. She surveyed the office that had been her domain for 8 years, the ergonomic chair where she'd spent countless hours reviewing compliance reports, the whiteboard still bearing notes from her last team meeting, the corkboard displaying congratulatory cards from colleagues who now avoided her gaze in hallways. Each object told a story of achievement and dedication, now rendered meaningless by her termination. As she followed the security guards toward the elevator bank, Alexandra's professional mask slipped for the briefest moment. Her reflection in the mirrored walls showed a woman barely recognizing herself, eyes red-rimmed but defiant, posture rigid with suppressed emotion. The ride down felt interminable, each floor indicator blinking like a timer counting down to her new reality. The lobby reception area buzzed with activity, oblivious to her departure. Young professionals queued for lattes at the cafe kiosk, interns scurried with armloads of documents, and executives strode purposefully toward glass-walled conference rooms. No one noticed as Alexandra crossed the marble expanse, her footsteps echoing like gunshots in the cavernous space. The automatic doors hissed open, releasing her into the crisp autumn air. Outside, the city continued its relentless pace, indifferent to her fall from grace. Yellow cabs honked in impatience, street vendors shouted their wares, and businesspeople rushed to their next appointments. Alexandra stood on the sidewalk, her breath visible in the cooling air, clutching her tote bag like a lifeline. For the first time in years, she was truly alone, no title, no office, no institutional protection. Just a woman with secrets that could topple an empire, standing on the precipice of an uncertain future. The days following her termination blurred into a haze of legal consultations, media inquiries, and sleepless nights spent strategizing her next move. Her apartment, once a sanctuary, now felt like a pressure cooker of anxiety and determination. The evidence she'd meticulously gathered over years became both her weapon and her burden, physical manifestations of corporate corruption stacked neatly in fireproof safes and encrypted hard drives. Each document represented not just a crime, but a betrayal of trust that cut deeper than any professional setback. Her mornings began with careful surveillance of her building's entrance, paranoia sharpened by the knowledge that corporate spies might be watching. She varied her routines, taking different routes to meet her lawyer, using burner phones for sensitive communications, and communicating through encrypted channels. The isolation weighed heavily, yet she found strength in her growing network of allies, former colleagues who'd witnessed the corruption firsthand, investigative journalists hungry for truth, and whistleblowers from other organizations who understood her predicament intimately. The decision to approach the Securities and Exchange Commission came during one of many late-night strategy sessions with her legal team. As dawn broke over the New York skyline, painting her cluttered living room in soft gold, Alexandra realized that true justice required more than just exposing the fraud. It demanded systemic change, a dismantling of the culture that had enabled such widespread corruption. The SEC's whistleblower program offered not just protection, but the opportunity to become part of the solution rather than merely an accuser. Her transformation from victim to avenger began with small but significant choices. She traded her corporate wardrobe for simpler, more practical clothing. Dark suits that spoke of authority rather than status, sturdy shoes meant for long days of testimony preparation. Her daily routine shifted from managing compliance issues to studying financial regulations, learning to navigate the complex bureaucracy she once served. Each step forward felt like shedding layers of her former self, emerging stronger and more determined with every passing day. The psychological toll manifested in unexpected ways. Simple tasks like grocery shopping or attending social events became minefields of potential recognition and judgment. Her reflection in store windows showed a woman whose eyes carried the weight of secrets too dangerous to share openly. Yet within this cocoon of secrecy, Alexandra discovered reserves of courage she never knew existed. The fear that once threatened to paralyze her transformed into fuel for her mission, each challenge strengthening her resolve to see justice served. Her apartment became command central for what she privately called Operation Redemption. Whiteboards covered in flowcharts tracked the progress of her case, connecting names and dates to specific violations. A dedicated section mapped out potential allies within regulatory bodies, their political leanings and professional histories carefully documented. Another wall displayed news articles about corporate scandals, reminding her daily of why her fight mattered. The transformation of her home reflected her own metamorphosis, from compliant corporate officer to crusader for ethical business practices. The turning point came during a particularly grueling week of depositions. Exhausted and emotionally drained, Alexandra found herself questioning whether the sacrifice was worth it. The answer came unexpectedly during a chance encounter with a young intern from her former company, who approached her after recognizing her from old press photos. The intern, eyes bright with admiration, confided that Alexandra's stand against corruption had inspired her generation to demand better from corporate America. In that moment, Alexandra understood that her journey wasn't just about revenge or justice, it was about creating a legacy of integrity that would ripple through future generations of business leaders. As weeks turned into months, Alexandra's preparation intensified. She studied landmark SEC cases, memorized relevant sections of financial regulations, and practiced her testimony until every detail was etched into her memory. Her legal team marveled at her dedication, often finding her still working when they arrived in the morning, surrounded by empty coffee cups and highlighted documents. The woman who had once feared losing everything now embraced her new identity with fierce determination, her every action driven by the knowledge that she was fighting not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been betrayed by corporate greed. The morning sunlight filtered through the vertical blinds of Alexandra's new office, casting alternating stripes of light and shadow across her desk. The nameplate on the door read Special Advisor to the SEC Commissioner, a title that still felt surreal despite months of preparation. Her workspace, though modest compared to her former corner office, radiated purpose, stacks of ongoing investigations neatly organized, whiteboards filled with case details, and a state-of-the-art secure communication system installed specifically for her role. The SEC had recognized the value of having someone with insider knowledge helping to reshape their enforcement strategies, and Alexandra had seized the opportunity with characteristic determination. Her first major project involved developing a comprehensive framework for identifying early warning signs of corporate fraud. Drawing from her experiences, she created a matrix of behavioral indicators and financial anomalies that had previously gone unnoticed by regulators. The model incorporated psychological profiling of corporate perpetrators, technical analysis of financial data manipulation techniques, and organizational patterns that typically preceded large-scale fraud. Her colleagues were astonished by the depth of her insights, particularly her ability to predict how seemingly minor compliance issues could snowball into massive scandals. During weekly strategy sessions with senior SEC officials, Alexandra's contributions consistently pushed boundaries. She advocated for more aggressive monitoring of corporate whistleblower programs, pointing out how companies often weaponize these systems against legitimate complaints. Her proposal for implementing anonymous reporting channels directly to the SEC gained traction after she demonstrated how existing systems could be easily manipulated by corporate legal teams. The agency's technological infrastructure began evolving under her influence, incorporating advanced data analytics tools she'd helped develop to detect subtle patterns of fraudulent behavior. The most challenging aspect proved to be navigating the complex politics of Washington, D.C.'s regulatory landscape. Alexandra quickly learned that effecting change required more than just presenting evidence. It demanded building alliances, understanding legislative agendas, and timing initiatives to align with broader policy goals. She cultivated relationships with key congressional staffers, participated in closed-door briefings, and helped draft position papers that would influence upcoming regulatory reforms. Her experience as a whistleblower gave her unique credibility when advocating for stronger protections and incentives for others in similar situations. Her work extended beyond traditional enforcement activities. Alexandra spearheaded a mentorship program connecting experienced investigators with younger staff, emphasizing the importance of recognizing cultural red flags within corporations. She organized workshops sharing her insights about how fraudsters exploited loopholes in existing regulations, helping SEC examiners develop more sophisticated detection methods. Her presentations, delivered with the authority of someone who had lived through the consequences of regulatory failures, became must-attend events for enforcement staff across regional offices. The personal toll remained significant, though she handled it differently now. Late nights at the SEC headquarters became her norm, the fluorescent lights of her office a comforting presence during intense periods of investigation planning. She maintained her network of trusted allies, though interactions were now conducted with even greater caution given her position. The stress manifested in new ways, precise organization of her workspace, methodical documentation of every decision, and an almost obsessive attention to procedural details that bordered on compulsion. Her greatest satisfaction came from seeing tangible results. When the SEC announced a record-breaking enforcement action against her former employer, based largely on the evidence and methodologies she'd contributed, Alexandra allowed herself a private moment of triumph. The settlement included unprecedented accountability measures, including the removal of several executives she'd identified as key conspirators. More importantly, the case established new precedents for corporate liability that would affect companies nationwide. As she settled into her role, Alexandra found herself mentoring other whistleblowers, guiding them through the complex process of exposing wrongdoing while protecting themselves legally and emotionally. These interactions reinforced her belief in the importance of her work, each new case adding to her understanding of how corporate fraud operated and how best to combat it. The SEC offices became her new battleground, where she wielded her experience and expertise to build a more effective enforcement apparatus, one that would make it significantly harder for companies to repeat the crimes she'd exposed. The transformation from whistleblower to regulator brought unforeseen challenges, particularly in dealing with media attention and public perception. While her appointment to the SEC had generated headlines, the narrative surrounding her story remained complicated. Some celebrated her as a hero of corporate accountability, while others questioned her motives or accused her of opportunism. Alexandra navigated this scrutiny with careful precision, knowing that her credibility was crucial to her effectiveness within the agency. Her days followed a carefully choreographed routine designed to maximize productivity while maintaining operational security. Morning briefings with her team always began precisely at 7:30 a.m., regardless of how late she'd worked the previous night. These sessions served multiple purposes: updating colleagues on active investigations, reviewing new intelligence, and coordinating with other regulatory bodies. The walls of her office gradually filled with annotated organizational charts, color-coded timelines of ongoing cases, and magnetic boards tracking resource allocation for major investigations. The psychological impact of her dual roles, investigator and investigated, manifested in subtle ways. She developed rituals to maintain focus: the precise arrangement of pens on her desk, the systematic review of case files in chronological order, the habit of walking precisely 20 laps around the office floor during breaks. These routines helped ground her when the weight of responsibility threatened to overwhelm. The stress occasionally surfaced in unexpected moments: a twitch in her left hand when reading particularly damning evidence, a tendency to triple-check secure communications, or sudden flashes of anxiety when encountering unfamiliar faces in SEC corridors. Relationships within the agency evolved over time. While some colleagues initially viewed her with suspicion, concerned about potential conflicts of interest, her unwavering commitment to due process and fair investigation gradually won them over. She earned particular respect from veteran enforcement staff who recognized how her insider perspective enhanced their capabilities. During high-stakes negotiations with corporate counsel, her ability to anticipate tactics and identify weaknesses proved invaluable, leading to several breakthrough settlements that strengthened the SEC's enforcement position. Her apartment underwent another transformation, becoming a hybrid workspace and secure repository for sensitive materials. The living room now housed a state-of-the-art secure communication station, approved by SEC cybersecurity experts, allowing her to coordinate with informants and review classified documents outside regular office hours. Her bedroom remained strictly off-limits to work-related activities, preserving a small sanctuary where she could attempt to decompress. The ritual of changing clothes upon returning home symbolized the transition from enforcer to private citizen, though the distinction often blurred during critical phases of investigations. The emotional toll of confronting former colleagues and industry contacts proved more challenging than expected. Each deposition, each review of familiar documents, triggered memories of betrayals and broken trust. She developed coping mechanisms, journaling her thoughts in a secure digital diary, practicing mindfulness techniques recommended by the SEC's wellness program, and maintaining regular check-ins with a therapist who specialized in trauma recovery for whistleblowers. These sessions helped her process the complex emotions stirred by her new role, particularly when she encountered resistance from former peers within the financial industry. Her weekends became dedicated to strategic planning and professional development. Saturday mornings typically involved reviewing academic papers on corporate governance and financial regulation, while afternoons were reserved for writing detailed analyses of emerging fraud patterns. Sundays focused on preparing for upcoming congressional testimonies or regulatory reform initiatives, often extending late into the evening as she refined arguments and anticipated counterpoints. These solitary hours of preparation helped maintain her edge in an environment where every statement and decision carried significant weight. The network of allies she'd cultivated expanded strategically. Former SEC commissioners provided historical context for current challenges, while retired investigators shared insights about navigating political pressures. She maintained carefully managed relationships with journalists who specialized in financial crime reporting, understanding the power of well-timed leaks to apply pressure on resistant targets. Each connection was documented in a meticulously maintained relationship management system, complete with notes about communication preferences and areas of mutual interest. As her influence within the SEC grew, Alexandra found herself increasingly involved in shaping the agency's long-term strategy. She participated in working groups examining the intersection of technology and financial regulation, contributed to policy papers on emerging risks in digital finance, and helped design training programs for new investigators. Her unique perspective bridged the gap between theoretical regulatory frameworks and practical enforcement challenges, making her input highly valued in discussions about future directions for the agency. The physical demands of her role became apparent in subtle ways. The constant pressure to stay informed led to chronic sleep deprivation, evidenced by the growing collection of empty coffee cups in her office recycling bin. The need to maintain peak mental performance resulted in a strict fitness regimen, scheduled religiously into her calendar. Even her diet became regimented, optimized for sustained energy during marathon investigation sessions and high-stakes negotiations. Despite the challenges, moments of vindication fueled her determination. Watching junior SEC staff adopt investigative techniques she'd pioneered, seeing new regulations implemented based on her recommendations, and observing corporate compliance programs evolve in response to increased enforcement pressure all reinforced her belief in the importance of her mission. Each success, no matter how small, contributed to a growing sense of purpose that transcended personal grievances and focused on systemic improvement. As Alexandra reviewed the latest intelligence reports in her SEC office, her mind kept returning to the unfinished business that had driven her transformation. The evidence she gathered during her time at the corporation represented only the tip of an iceberg that extended far beyond a single company's walls. Her analysis had revealed patterns suggesting a network of interconnected schemes spanning multiple industries and financial institutions. The scale of potential corruption was staggering, requiring nothing less than a complete overhaul of how corporate oversight was conducted. Her strategic plan took shape on the whiteboard wall of her office, divided into 3 parallel tracks of action. The first focused on immediate enforcement actions against her former employer and its known associates. She'd already identified several executives who had moved to new positions, potentially spreading their corrupt practices to other organizations. The second track targeted structural weaknesses in regulatory frameworks that had allowed such extensive fraud to flourish unchecked. Her proposals for reform included enhanced monitoring of inter-company transactions, stricter requirements for independent audits, and real-time reporting systems that would make manipulation more difficult. The third and most ambitious track addressed the cultural rot that had enabled the fraud in the first place. Alexandra envisioned a comprehensive initiative to transform corporate governance practices across multiple sectors. This would involve mandatory ethics training for executives, whistleblower protection measures that actually worked, and incentive structures that rewarded transparency rather than short-term profits. She'd already begun drafting guidelines for what she termed corporate integrity standards, drawing from both her experiences and successful models implemented in other regulatory environments. The timeline for execution stretched over several years, with carefully planned phases of implementation. The initial wave of enforcement actions would serve as both punishment and warning, demonstrating the SEC's new capabilities and determination. Following this, a series of high-profile prosecutions would establish legal precedents that would strengthen the agency's position in future cases. Concurrently, she intended to push for legislative changes that would give regulators more teeth and reduce the influence of corporate lobbying on enforcement decisions. Her network of allies played a crucial role in this grand strategy. Within the SEC, she'd assembled a task force of dedicated investigators who understood the scope of what they were facing. External partners included investigative journalists willing to help expose wrongdoing, academics specializing in corporate ethics, and tech experts capable of developing the sophisticated monitoring systems she envisioned. Each member of this coalition had been carefully vetted and brought on board with clear objectives and defined roles. The most challenging aspect of her plan involved predicting and countering the inevitable backlash from powerful interests. Corporate lobbyists were already mobilizing against proposed reforms, while industry groups launched public relations campaigns portraying increased regulation as harmful to economic growth. Alexandra had anticipated these moves and developed counter-strategies, including media partnerships to shape public opinion and grassroots mobilization efforts to build support for stronger oversight. Financial considerations presented another layer of complexity. Implementing her vision would require significant resources, from hiring additional enforcement staff to developing advanced analytical tools. She'd prepared detailed cost-benefit analyses showing how investing in prevention would ultimately save taxpayer money by reducing the frequency and severity of financial scandals. These documents became her primary ammunition in budget negotiations with government appropriations committees. Her evenings were now consumed with refining this master plan, adjusting tactics based on new intelligence and feedback from various stakeholders. The walls of her apartment joined those of her office in displaying detailed diagrams and flowcharts, each element representing a piece of the larger puzzle she was assembling. Sleep became even more elusive as she wrestled with the implications of each decision, knowing that failure could undermine years of work and allow similar frauds to continue unchecked. The personal sacrifices required by this undertaking became more apparent with each passing day. Friendships outside her professional circle dwindled as she dedicated more time to her mission. Social invitations went unanswered, family gatherings were postponed, and personal milestones passed uncelebrated. Yet with each obstacle overcome, each victory achieved, Alexandra felt her purpose crystallizing. This wasn't just about revenge or even justice anymore, it was about fundamentally altering the landscape of corporate accountability, ensuring that future generations of employees and investors wouldn't have to endure the betrayal she'd faced. As she connected the final lines on her whiteboard strategy map, Alexandra allowed herself a moment of reflection. The woman who had once sat in a corporate boardroom, isolated and vulnerable, had transformed into someone capable of reshaping an entire regulatory ecosystem. The road ahead promised to be long and fraught with challenges, but she now possessed something more valuable than vengeance, the means to create lasting change. 2 years later, Alexandra stood in the SEC's press conference room as cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions. The landmark case against her former employer had resulted in a $1.2 billion settlement, the largest in corporate fraud history. Executives who had once dismissed her concerns now faced criminal charges, while new regulations she'd championed were being adopted nationwide. Looking out at the crowd, Alexandra caught sight of Maria, her former assistant, now thriving in a leadership role at a company that embraced ethical practices. A young SEC intern approached her afterward, thanking her for paving the way for a new generation of regulators. As she packed up her notes, Alexandra realized she wasn't just closing a chapter, she was opening doors for others to walk through. That evening, she returned to her apartment, now filled with sunlight rather than shadows. The walls were bare except for a single framed quote, "Justice is truth in action." For the first time in years, Alexandra slept soundly, knowing she'd done more than take revenge. She'd built a legacy of integrity that would endure long after she was gone.